The morning air was crisp, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter around you. Cars rushed past on the busy street. People walked by without a second glance, lost in their own world. But in the same spot, right near the old gas station at the edge of town, sat a German shepherd. His fur, once thick and golden, had dulled over the years. His eyes, deep and soulful, carried a quiet sadness. Yet he waited, every single day, for something only he understood. No one knew exactly when he first appeared, but the workers at the station said it had been nearly 4 years. 4 long years of waiting in the same place, through scorching summers and freezing winters. He never strayed far, never left that small corner near the curb, as if he believed, with all his heart, that someone would return for him. The people who passed by often felt sorry for him. Some left food, some tried to pet him, but he was never interested in attention. He would eat just enough to survive, then return to his waiting, eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if any moment now they would come back. For a long time no one really knew his story. Some thought he had been abandoned, left behind by owners who no longer wanted him. Others believed he had simply gotten lost and couldn't find his way home. But the truth, when it finally came out, was far more heartbreaking. He had once been part of a family he had loved more than anything in the world. And then one day they were gone. It happened so suddenly, too fast for a dog to understand. One moment, he was riding happily in the back of their car, his tongue hanging out, ears perked up with excitement. Then there was confusion, voices raised, the car door opening, and the ground suddenly beneath his paws. He must have thought it was just a stop, just another moment before they called him back inside. But the car drove away, its taillights disappearing into the distance, leaving him standing there alone. At first he had run after them. His strong legs carried him as fast as they could, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't catch up. He had barked, whined, waited. Surely they would come back. Surely this was all just a mistake. But hours turned into days, days into weeks, and then years. Still he remained. Over time, people in the town began to recognize him. Some called him Max, others Rex, but no one knew his real name. He belonged to no one, and yet, in a way, he belonged to everyone. He had become a part of the street, a silent guardian of his own memories. He never caused trouble, never begged for food. He only waited. And then, one cold morning, something changed. It was early, just before sunrise. The town was still asleep, the streets quiet except for the occasional hum of an engine passing by. The German shepherd, as always, was in his spot, curled up to keep warm. But this morning there was something different in the air, something he could sense before anyone else. His ears twitched, his head lifted, and his eyes locked onto the road. Car was approaching. At first, it seemed like any other vehicle, another passerby who would come and go. But the closer it got, the more his body tensed. His heart pounded in his chest, an instinct so deep, so familiar, it made him stand up without even thinking. And then, the car slowed down. The engine hummed as it rolled to a stop just a few feet away. The door opened. And in that moment, after 4 years of waiting, something happened that no one in town would ever forget. For a moment everything was still. The morning air hung heavy with silence, broken only by the soft hum of the idling engine. The German shepherd's breath quickened. His ears stood tall, his body frozen in place as his sharp eyes stayed locked on the open car door. A figure stepped out. The dog didn't move. He barely even blinked. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he could hear it in his ears. His tail, which had long forgotten the habit of wagging, twitched slightly, uncertain. He had seen thousands of cars come and go over the years. He had watched so many people step out, look at him with pity, offer food, a kind word, but none of them had mattered. None of them were the ones he was waiting for. But something about this moment was different. The person in front of him stood still, just like he did. They weren't trying to call him over, weren't trying to pet him or lure him with food. They were just watching him. And then a sound, soft, barely a whisper but familiar. Voice. His ears twitched again. His name. It wasn't the name people in the town had given him. Not Max, not Rex, not anything random. This was something else. Something buried deep in his memories. A sound he hadn't heard in years, but one that had once meant everything to him. The dog took a step forward. Just one. His muscles were stiff from sleeping on the cold pavement, but he barely noticed. His nose twitched, trying to catch a scent carried in the breeze. It was faint, almost lost in the city smells of gasoline and dust. But beneath it, there was something familiar. Something safe. The person took a step forward too, but slow, careful, as if afraid to startle him. Then, another word. This time it was softer, gentler. The way someone would speak to an old friend they never thought they'd see again. The dog's body tensed. His eyes flickered with something between recognition and doubt. Could it really be? But before he could move again, the moment was interrupted. A loud honk from a passing truck shattered the quiet. The dog flinched, his body reacting on instinct, stepping back quickly. The person in front of him froze too, as if realizing just how fragile this moment was. The spell had been broken. The dog's breath was uneven. His legs suddenly unsure. He had waited for so long, stayed in this place for years, but now that something was happening, now that someone was standing right in front of him, he didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to run forward, to press his face against the person's hands, to feel the warmth he had missed for so long. But another part of him hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if he let himself believe just for a second, and then the car drove away just like before? His mind swirled with memories he didn't fully understand. Images flashed, running through a field, a ball bouncing in front of him, laughter, a child's small hands wrapping around his neck. Then darkness, the feeling of being left behind, the endless waiting, the loneliness. The German shepherd took another step back. The person's face shifted, the hope in their eyes flickering with something else. Sadness. A realization that this was not going to be easy. And then, without another word, they crouched down, slowly, carefully, until they were at his level. They reached into their pocket and pulled something out. Collar. It was old, worn, but still intact. And hanging from it a tag. Rusted around the edges, but the name engraved on it was clear. His real name. The dog's breath caught. His legs trembled. His eyes locked onto the tag, and for the first time in years, something inside him cracked. Memories rushed back all at once. House. A yard with a wooden fence. A little girl laughing as she hugged him, her small arms barely able to reach all the way around his thick fur. A man and a woman calling his name, their voices filled with warmth. Dinners together, nights curled up at their feet, the comfort of knowing he belonged. And then the car ride. The confusion. Being left behind. The dog let out a low, shaky whimper. The person in front of him didn't move, didn't say anything, just held out the collar, waiting. He had been waiting for 4 years. Was it possible that someone had been waiting for him too? The city moved around them as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Cars passed, people walked by. Streetlights changed from red to green, unaware of the moment unfolding on the sidewalk. But to the German shepherd, time had stopped. For 4 years, he had learned to expect nothing. To wait and wait, but never to hope. Now, standing in front of the person who spoke his name, holding the collar he once wore, could he allow himself to believe? His paws shifted against the pavement. His body swayed forward, then back, as if caught between the past and the present. The person whispered his name again. And this time he didn't step away. But he didn't move closer either. He just stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what to do next. And then, a tear fell from the person's eye. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. Just a single tear rolling down their cheek, catching the morning light as it slipped down their face. The German shepherd's ears flicked. He watched it fall, and something about that moment, something about seeing them cry, broke through the last of his hesitation. He took one slow step forward. Then another. And as he moved closer, his nose brushing against the familiar scent of the collar, the past and present collided, forcing him to make a choice. To keep waiting, or to finally go home. The German shepherd's body trembled as he stood there, inches away from the collar, from the person who had spoken his name. The morning light was softer now, casting a golden hue on the street, but the world around him still felt uncertain. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing uneven. The person didn't move, didn't push. They just waited. The dog had waited for years. But now that the moment was here, now that someone had come for him, he found himself frozen. The memories had returned in flashes, but they weren't enough. He didn't know if he could trust them. He didn't know if he could trust himself. Then suddenly a voice from behind. "He won't go with you." The dog's ears twitched, and he turned his head slightly to see an older man standing a few feet away. It was the owner of the small grocery store across the street. He had seen this man before many times. He was one of the few people who always left food by the sidewalk. Never too close, never forcing anything, just enough to make sure the dog didn't go hungry. The man sighed, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "I've been watching him for years," he said, his voice steady, though there was something sad in it. "People come and go. Some try to take him, some try to help. But he never leaves." The person holding the collar looked up, their eyes filled with something the old man couldn't quite read. "He's been waiting for his family," the person whispered. The older man nodded. "No. But what if they're not coming back?" The German shepherd's eyes flickered between the two of them. The weight of those words settled over him like a heavy fog. He didn't understand everything they were saying, but he felt it. The doubt. The question he had tried to bury deep inside himself for years. What if they really weren't coming back? The thought sent a chill through him, deeper than any winter he had endured on this street. He had clung to hope, but had it been pointless? Had he been nothing more than a ghost, waiting for something that no longer existed? The person in front of him swallowed hard. "They are coming back," they said, but their voice was softer now, like they were trying to convince themselves as much as the dog. They didn't leave him. Not on purpose. The older man sighed again, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked at the German shepherd, his expression gentle. "Even if that's true," he said, "the question is, does he still believe it?" The dog's breath hitched. Did he? He had spent so long waiting. He had stayed in the same place, night after night, year after year. But now, standing here, feeling the warmth of someone who might actually know him, who had called his name like it still meant something. His heart was caught between fear and something else. Something he had forgotten how to feel. Then, before he could think any further, movement. A young woman stepped out of the car. She had been sitting in the passenger seat, silent until now. But as soon as she saw him, a soft gasp escaped her lips. The German shepherd turned his head, watching her closely. And then, she whispered something. Name. His name. And this time he knew that it was real. His whole body tensed, his breath catching in his throat. He took a step back, eyes locked on her face. And then all at once he saw it. The missing piece. She had been smaller back then. Just a child. He remembered her voice, her laughter, the way she used to wrap her arms around his neck and bury her face in his fur. His tail, which had been motionless for so long, gave a single hesitant wag. The young woman covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "It's really you," she whispered. The dog's heart was racing now. Everything felt too big, too overwhelming. He wanted to run to her, but at the same time, something inside him still held back. Because the memory of being left behind was still there. The pain of watching that car drive away. The endless days of waiting, of wondering if he had done something wrong. And then, before anyone could move, another interruption. A voice, a deep, rough voice, calling from across the street. "That your dog?" The group turned. A man stood near the gas station, his arms crossed. He looked rough, like someone who had seen too much of life on the streets. His eyes landed on the German shepherd, and something dark flickered in them. "I've seen him around," the man said, taking a step forward. "If you're looking to take him, you better be sure he's yours. 'Cause that dog don't belong to just anybody." The older man from the grocery store stiffened. "Leave them alone, Rick." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "Relax. Just saying, this dog's been out here a long time. Some of us have been looking out for him." He tilted his head slightly. "Maybe he don't need saving." The German shepherd lowered his body slightly, ears pinned back. He didn't trust this man. He never had. The young woman stepped forward protectively. "He does belong to someone," she said firmly. "He belongs to us." Rick smirked. "Then why'd he end up here?" The question cut through the air like a blade. The dog let out a low, uncertain whine. He didn't understand the words, but he felt the weight of them. Because part of him had wondered the same thing. If he belonged to them, why had they left him behind? The young woman's eyes darkened, her hands clenching into fists. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We thought," she broke off, shaking her head. The person with the collar reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. A silent comfort. Rick watched them for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Suit yourselves," he muttered, stepping back into the shadows of the gas station. The tension remained even after he was gone. The young woman turned back to the dog, her eyes searching his. "Please," she whispered. "Come home." The German shepherd's heart ached. He wanted to believe. He wanted to move forward, to let go of the years of loneliness and doubt. But something still held him back. Because even if this was his family, even if they had come back for him, questions still remained. Why had they left him in the first place? And could he trust them not to do it again? The street felt quieter now, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, thick with uncertainty. The German shepherd stood still, his paws rooted to the pavement, torn between the past and the present. The young woman was still watching him, her eyes pleading, waiting for him to move, to come to her. But he didn't. He couldn't. His heart was pulling him in two directions. He wanted to run to her, to feel the warmth of his old life again, but something deep inside still held him back. The memories of being left behind, the endless nights of waiting, the moments he had given up hope, those feelings weren't easy to forget. The person holding the collar let out a slow breath, then crouched lower, trying to meet him at his level. "We looked for you," they said softly. "We never stopped looking." The words were gentle, but they didn't erase the ache inside his chest. The dog's ears flicked, his body tense. He wanted to believe them. He really did. The older man from the grocery store shifted slightly. "If that's true," he said, "then why did it take so long?" The young woman's face crumpled. "We didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We thought," she stopped herself, shaking her head as if trying to push away painful memories. "It was an accident. We were moving to a new house, and on the way there was a stop. Break. Just a few minutes." She swallowed hard. Then he was gone. The German shepherd's ears perked up slightly. The way she said it, the pain in her voice, made something shift inside him. "We searched for days," the person with the collar added. "Weeks. We put up posters, called shelters, everything. But we didn't know where you had gone." Their voice broke slightly. "We thought," they hesitated, glancing at the dog with an expression full of guilt. "We thought someone took you." The dog let out a quiet breath. Pieces of the past swirled in his mind, but they didn't fit together. He remembered a busy street, cars rushing by. The confusion, panic, the feeling of searching for something, someone that he couldn't find. Had he been the one lost? For years, he had believed that they had left him, that they had driven away and never looked back. But what if it wasn't true? What if they had been looking for him all along? The young woman took a small step forward, careful not to scare him. "You were never forgotten," she whispered. "Not for a single day." The dog swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. His tail twitched slightly, as if caught between the instinct to wag and the fear of letting himself feel hope. Then movement. A car door slammed somewhere down the street, and the noise sent a jolt through his body. His instincts kicked in before he could stop them. His legs moved, his body turning, ready to run. But before he could, he heard it again. His name. Not the name strangers had called him. Not the name the people in town had given him. His real name. It stopped him in his tracks. His paws skidded slightly against the pavement as he turned his head back. The young woman had tears streaming down her face now. Her hands clenched over her heart. "Please," she said again. "Come home." The air was thick with tension. The old man watched in silence. Rick was somewhere in the shadows, observing. The city moved around them, unaware that something life-changing was happening on this small street corner. The German shepherd's body trembled. His mind was at war with itself. For years. 4 years of waiting. 4 years of believing he had been abandoned. 4 years of loneliness. Could he let it go? Could he take that step forward? He lowered his head, ears flattening against his skull. His heart pounded. His name still echoed in his ears, calling him back to a life he thought he had lost forever. And then, just as he was about to move, another voice. Familiar. A voice from the past. One word. Spoken softly, filled with so much emotion it made his legs weak. Name. The name he had known before everything changed. The name he had been waiting for. And in that moment the world stopped. The decision was right in front of him. One final choice. To leave behind everything he had known for the past 4 years. Or to finally go home. The German shepherd's whole body stiffened at the sound of that voice. It was deeper now, older, but something about it struck him like lightning. His ears twitched, his breath hitched. His heart, already fragile from years of waiting, pounded so hard it hurt. The voice came from behind the young woman. Slowly, hesitantly she turned and there, stepping out of the car, was a man. His face was lined with exhaustion. His hair dusted with gray that hadn't been there before. But his eyes were the same. The dog took a step back, confusion flickering in his gaze. His instincts screamed at him to run, to protect himself, but at the same time, something in him refused to move. The man swallowed hard, his hand gripping the car door like he needed it to steady himself. Then, with a voice thick with emotion, he said it again. The dog's name. A whimper slipped from the German shepherd's throat before he could stop it. This was different from when the young woman had called him. This was something deeper, something older. A connection buried so far inside him that it had almost been forgotten. But not completely. The man took a step closer, then stopped himself, like he knew he couldn't rush this. His hands were shaking. His lips parted like he wanted to say something more, but no words came. The weight of years, of distance, of guilt, hung heavy between them. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, another voice cut through the air. "You lied to me." The words were sharp, cold. They came from behind, from the direction of the gas station. Vic. The German shepherd snapped his head toward him. The man was no longer leaning casually against the wall. His posture was stiff, his jaw clenched. But it wasn't anger in his eyes. It was something else. Something darker. The young woman's brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Rick let out a dry, humorless laugh. "This whole time you acted like you didn't know where he came from. Like he was just some lost dog you were looking for." He shook his head, his fists curling at his sides. "But that's not true, is it?" The tension in the air thickened. The older man from the grocery store shifted uncomfortably. "Rick, don't start something you'll regret." Rick ignored him. His eyes stayed locked on the family, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at the dog, the same dog he had watched roam these streets for years. "You didn't lose him," Rick said, his voice quieter now but no less sharp. "You left him." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The young woman's face paled. "No, that's not." Rick scoffed. Don't lie to me. His voice rose slightly. For years. 4 years, that dog sat in the same place, waiting for people who never came back. You expect me to believe you didn't know? The German Shepherd lowered his head, his breathing uneven. He didn't understand the full conversation, but he felt the shift in the air. The energy had changed. Something wasn't right. The man, the one who had called his name, finally spoke again. His voice was hoarse. We never meant to leave him. Rick's eyes narrowed. Then why did you? The young woman opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at the man beside her, searching his face for an answer, for something to say that could make it better. But he had nothing. For the first time since stepping out of the car, he looked away. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. The German Shepherd watched closely, his instincts sharpening. There was something about the man's reaction that made him uneasy. Rick let out a bitter laugh. That's what I thought. He took a step closer. So tell me, did you think he wouldn't remember? That after all these years, he'd just forget what happened? The young woman's breath was shaky. It wasn't like that. Rick shook his head. Then what was it like? Silence. The German Shepherd's tail lowered slightly. His body tensed. He didn't like this. He didn't like the way the air felt. The man exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. Finally, after what felt like forever, he spoke. We didn't lose him, he admitted. His voice was quiet, heavy. We left him behind. The words sent a jolt through the dog's body. The young woman flinched, her eyes widening. Dad. Rick let out a slow, grim chuckle. Now that sounds like the truth. The German Shepherd felt something crack inside him. He had waited. Every single day he had waited. Through the rain, the cold, the unbearable heat. He had stayed in the same place, believing, knowing that they would come back for him. But they had chosen to leave. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't fate. It was a choice. His body trembled, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Something deeper. Betrayal. The man finally looked up, and for the first time the German Shepherd saw it. The guilt in his eyes. The regret. We thought it was for the best, he said, his voice breaking. We didn't have a choice. But the dog wasn't listening anymore. His breathing was shallow. His ears pinned back. His tail tucked slightly between his legs. 4 years. 4 years of waiting. For this. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. I never wanted this. Rick shook his head in disgust. And yet, here we are. The German Shepherd took another step back. His head lowered, his body tense. He wanted to run, but his legs felt frozen. Rick turned to him now, his expression softer. I know it hurts, buddy, he murmured. I really do. His gaze flickered back to the man. But at least now you know the truth. The young woman stepped forward suddenly. No, please. But it was too late. The German Shepherd had already turned. And this time he didn't stop. He ran. He ran like he had 4 years ago. When he had first realized he was alone. When he had first understood that the people he loved weren't coming back. But this time they had come back. And it didn't change anything. Because the truth was finally clear. He had waited for them. But they had never really been waiting for him. And as the world blurred around him, one final thought burned in his chest. Maybe they weren't his family anymore. Maybe he didn't have one. The German Shepherd ran as fast as his legs would carry him. His breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The streets blurred past him, familiar yet distant, as if the place he had once known no longer belonged to him. The echoes of voices, of names called out behind him, faded into the wind. He didn't stop. He couldn't. His heart pounded against his ribs. His chest tight with something heavier than exhaustion. It wasn't supposed to be like this. For 4 years. He had imagined the moment they would return. He had dreamed of it, held on to it through the coldest nights, through the loneliest days. But the reality was nothing like what he had pictured. They hadn't been searching all this time. They hadn't been held back by fate or misfortune. They had chosen to leave him. And that choice had broken something inside him. He kept running until his legs burned, until the streets stretched out into the open fields beyond the town. The place where he had waited for them. The place where it had all begun. The sky above him darkened, clouds shifting like they were carrying the weight of his sorrow. He slowed, his paws heavy against the dirt, his breath uneven. He stood at the same spot he had claimed years ago, staring at the empty road that had taken them away. And for the first time since that day, he didn't wait. He lay down, but not to keep watch. Not to hold on to hope. Not to believe in something that had never been real. He lay down because he was tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of longing for a family that had stopped being his long ago. The wind shifted, carrying a scent with it. One that made his ears twitch. His head lift slightly. It was faint but unmistakable. He turned his head toward the source, his body tensing. A step. Not running. Not chasing. Just approaching. Low. Careful. The German shepherd didn't move. Didn't look away from the horizon. But he heard them stop just a few feet behind him. A quiet moment passed, filled only with the distant rustling of the wind. Then a familiar voice spoke. I get it now, Vic. The German shepherd didn't turn, but his ears flicked slightly. Rick exhaled, the sound slow, steady. You waited all this time, he murmured. Because you thought they'd come back for you. Because you thought they wanted to come back for you. But they didn't. The German shepherd lowered his head slightly. His breath steady but heavy. I thought you were waiting because you had nowhere else to go, Rick continued. But that wasn't it, was it? His voice softened. You had a home. You just didn't know when to stop waiting for it. The words settled between them. Rick sat down in the dirt a few feet away. He didn't try to touch the dog. Didn't try to pull him back or convince him of anything. He just sat there, quiet, present. The German shepherd shifted slightly. He wasn't sure why, but the weight in his chest felt different now. Not gone, but lighter. Like a door had been left open just wide enough to let something else in. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Then Rick spoke again. I don't know what you're feeling right now, he admitted. But I know this. He looked out at the road with him, at the place where the dog had waited so long. You don't have to stay here anymore. The German shepherd's breath hitched slightly. He wasn't sure why, but those words did something to him. He had spent so long believing he belonged to a family that had left him behind. But maybe family wasn't just the people who had once loved you. Maybe it was the ones who still did. The ones who didn't leave. The ones who stayed. Rick slowly stood up. I'm not gonna force you, he said. But I'll be heading back soon. He hesitated for just a second, then added, and if you want, you can come with me. The German shepherd swallowed. He didn't turn. Didn't move. Rick gave a small nod, as if he understood. Whatever you decide, he said. Just don't keep waiting for something that isn't coming back. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The dog sat there, his body still. His mind raced. Rick's footsteps faded into the distance. The wind blew softly. And then, the German shepherd stood up. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He just turned and walked toward home. The German shepherd's steps were slow at first, uncertain, but with each stride, something in him felt lighter. The weight of the past, the years of waiting, the questions that had haunted him, it all seemed to loosen bit by bit with every step he took. He didn't glance back at the road where he had spent so many days hoping. For the first time in 4 years, he wasn't looking back at all. Rick's figure was small in the distance, walking toward town. His hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He wasn't calling for the dog, wasn't waiting anxiously to see if he would follow. He had meant what he said. This was the shepherd's choice. And somehow that made it easier. The dog quickened his pace. His heartbeat steady but strong. His paws, worn from years of standing in one place, now moved with purpose. The town grew closer, the warm scent of food, people, and life filling his senses. It wasn't the same place he had once called home, but maybe it could be something else. Something new. Rick reached his truck, and just as he opened the door, he turned slightly. His breath caught when he saw the German Shepherd standing a few feet away, watching him. The dog's tail swayed just slightly, hesitant but hopeful. Rick exhaled, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. Instead, he just opened the passenger door and stepped back. He didn't coax or plead. He just waited. The German Shepherd stood there for a moment. Then, with a final glance at the town behind him, he stepped forward and hopped inside. The door shut gently, sealing a decision that had been years in the making. The drive was quiet at first. The German Shepherd lay in the passenger seat, his body finally at rest. Rick glanced at him every now and then, as if checking to make sure he was real, that he was really here. "You're gonna be all right," Rick murmured after a while. The dog didn't respond, but something in his posture softened. The truck rumbled down the road, past old buildings, past the gas station where the young woman and her father had stood. They weren't there anymore, and the shepherd didn't look for them. Maybe they had driven away. Maybe they were still in town, still searching for something they couldn't name. But it didn't matter anymore. They had made their choice. And now so had he. When Rick pulled into his driveway, the German Shepherd lifted his head. The house was small but sturdy, sitting at the edge of town, surrounded by a wide, open yard. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't what the dog had imagined home to be. But it felt right. Rick got out and walked around to open the door. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. The shepherd hesitated for only a second before jumping down. His paws met solid ground. Not the cold pavement of the streets, not the dirt where he had waited, but something in between. Something steady. Rick led him to the front door, but before stepping inside, he turned and crouched down, looking the dog in the eye. "You don't have to stay," he said. "But if you do, I'll be here." The German Shepherd didn't move right away. He studied Rick's face, searching for something. Some hidden doubt, some reason to run. But all he found was patience. He took a slow breath and stepped inside. The warmth wrapped around him immediately, the scent of a home lived in. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was just quiet. Rick stood up and closed the door behind them. For the first time in years, the German Shepherd wasn't outside. He wasn't waiting. He wasn't lost. Rick walked over to the kitchen, opening a cupboard. "I don't have much dog food yet," he admitted, pulling out a can of something that looked like a poor excuse for a meal. "Guess I wasn't planning on bringing anyone home today." He glanced at the dog, smirking a little. "But here we are." The German Shepherd watched him, ears perked slightly. He wasn't sure what to make of all of this yet, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Rick poured the food into a bowl and set it down. The dog hesitated, then stepped forward and took a bite. It wasn't anything special, but it was food. It was offered to him, not as a handout, not as pity, but as a part of something. Place. He ate slowly, and Rick just sat at the table, watching him in quiet companionship. The silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't tense. It was something else. Something that felt an awful lot like understanding. The night stretched on, the warmth of the house settling deep into the shepherd's bones. He lay down near the couch, his body finally at peace. Rick glanced at him from his chair, shaking his head lightly with a small chuckle. "Guess I should probably figure out a name for you," he mused. The German Shepherd blinked sleepily. He already had a name that had once meant something. But now it felt like it belonged to another time, another life. Maybe it was time for something new. Rick exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "We'll figure it out in the morning," he said, closing his eyes for a moment. "You're home now." The words settled in the quiet space between them. The German shepherd curled up a little tighter, feeling, for the first time in a long time, like he didn't have to keep watch. He didn't have to wait anymore. Tomorrow the sun would rise again. Tomorrow things would keep moving forward. But tonight, in the warmth of a place that was slowly becoming home, he finally let himself rest.